While we're waiting, I would invite you to type your name and your company into the chat, and that way Sam can see who's in the room. That'll save us some time from doing introductions and also give our presenter an idea of who's in his audience. Thanks. I'd like to say good morning on behalf of the Columbus Chamber of Commerce and welcome to Taking Care of the Pleasure to introduce Sam Artery, our presenter today. Sam is a national mediator, speaker, trainer, and author on conflict, negotiation, and mediation. And he's mediated more than 4,000 cases and tried dozens of jury trials to verdict. He's a partner at Bunger and Robertson over in Bloomington. He works in legal and non-legal settings and has an approach to conflict that encourages introspection and good health to complement internal and external business practices. You can order a copy of his book, Positively Conflicted, Engaging with Courage, Compassion, and Wisdom in a Combative World, on Amazon. We're going to give a couple copies away today at the end of the session. In addition, Sam teaches negotiation at the IU Maurer School of Law, where he has been distinguished as an outstanding adjunct faculty member. He's taught hundreds of law students who practice around the world. Sam is smart, well respected by his peers, and just an all-around good guy. And it is our pleasure to have him here today to talk once again. Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Melissa, for doing all the organizational work. And thank you for any of you who are here for coming this year, and for some of you that were here last year. I appreciate you coming again. And thank you for such a kind introduction. What I'm going to do today is last year we talked a lot about fear. We talked a lot about some of the negotiation basics. I'm going to give people some specific things to do, and for some reason my thing is not going here, so let's see if we can do that first. There we go. If you want to contact me after today, you can read my blogs at my website. My Instagram account is @SamArtery. I'd be delighted to connect with any of you. And LinkedIn is Sam Artery, a lot of repetition here. And my email is sartery@lawbr.com. So feel free to reach out to me. If you want this, the slides are copyrighted, but if you want the slides, I will send them to you. Here is the fee. I will ask you to answer a 4-question survey. There will be no charge beyond that. But if you want the slides, I'll ask you to answer those questions, please. And this is just a repeat of how to contact me. The book, Cindy, thank you for acknowledging it, and thank you for any of you that may read it. If you do read it, I'd be delighted if you posted a review on Amazon. If it's a good review, if not, send me an email and tell me why you didn't like it. But I'd be happy to have any feedback you might want to give. I negotiate, I teach, I consult, I write, I speak like I'm doing today. I do individual trainings with people, and I consult with individuals on problems inside the organizations, including lawyers and non-lawyers. So just to give you an example, in the last couple of weeks, I talked to a California medical director about a negotiation she was going through. I talked to a New York employment lawyer, and I talked to a woman who I'd mediated with, a lawyer from Birmingham, Alabama, whose book club was having a conflict, and we discussed that. So this stuff hopefully applies to more than just your work settings, and I hope you find that as well. I want to say a little bit, we talked about conflict, or we have talked about conflict before. Here's my definition of conflict. It arises whenever opposing forces or desires collide and cannot be readily reconciled. And that conflict can be internal when you're negotiating with yourself, say whether I'm going to get out of bed in the morning to keep the appointment I've kept, or whether I'm going to stay and pull the covers over my head and go back to sleep. That's a negotiation. It's an internal negotiation, but it's a negotiation. And here's the response I find that most people have to conflict and also to negotiation. Why don't you change so I'll feel better? Isn't that the place you want to start? Whether it's with your spouse or partner at home, or whether it's with your kids or somebody you may disagree with at work, it's why don't you change so I'll feel better? I mean, that's the place we all want to start a negotiation, because at that point, then there's no more conflict if that person changes. You tell me how that works for you. I haven't found it working so well for me. And if you wonder about where this applies, my guess is you have been this couple, or you have known this couple where one of them starts telling a story about what happened, and the other one says, no, it didn't happen that way. Or no, we met at 8 o'clock, or it wasn't at Starbucks, it was at McDonald's. And all of a sudden it becomes a different conflict or a different negotiation just about how the story is told. And the way we make sense of our lives in many ways are the stories we tell about conflict or things we've negotiated. So when you find yourself kind of chomping at the bit to interrupt somebody else's story, it may or may not be correct. It's the way they remember it. Give them a chance to tell the story. And that can be really hard if you think they've got the details wrong. So here's one of the things I like to remember. Amor Towles wrote a book called Rules of Civility. And this is one of the quotes in the book. If in times of high emotion, the next thing you're about to say makes you feel better, it's probably the wrong thing to say. And again, if you've not experienced that, you're different from me, but I experience it almost daily. And there's just kind of this need to get it out, and it often is not helpful, particularly in a negotiation or a conflict. So here's what we're going to do today. I want to review some basics. I want to talk, and I'm going to spend some time with this, the single biggest mistake that I find people make. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the science of influence and 6 principles of influence that I think you can actually apply, one or more, as you're preparing to negotiate. We'll finish with points to remember and takeaways. Actions, truly something you can do. And then questions and anything is fair game. It does not have to be something that we talked about today. So all conflict and negotiation begins with an agenda. If there is no agenda, if you don't have something that I want, or if I don't have something that you want, there is no agenda. The status quo is fine. Negotiation is always for some kind of change. If the status quo is just okay with us, there is nothing to negotiate. This is one, and sometimes we have an agenda that we didn't even know we had. And this is a story about my wife and me, and she's given me permission. I'm not going to tell as many stories about her this year as last. We're sitting at the kitchen table, and I was talking to her. We're having a cup of coffee in the morning, and I was talking to her about a decision, an employment decision we'd made at our office. So I told her what we decided, and I said, come on, Patty, tell me what you think. And so she did. She started telling me what she thought. And the longer she told me, the more frustrated and angry I got. And finally, she just stops and looks at me. She said, Sam, I don't get this. You asked me a question. All I'm doing is answering the question, and you're angry. And I said, until just now, it had never occurred to me that you might think about this differently from me. So I asked her a question about what she thought. She was simply answering the question. I didn't even know what was behind the question I was asking. I really didn't want to know what she thought. I wanted her to affirm the decision I'd already made. So when you find yourself negotiating, if you see that you're angry and surprised that you're angry at the other person, you probably had some kind of an agenda that you didn't think was there, didn't know was there, and it's being threatened in some way. So pay attention to those physical cues. I said this last year, I say this every time I talk about negotiation, and it's going to play into when we start talking about the single biggest mistake that people make. Make it as easy as possible for the other person to do what you want them to do. If you watch TV shows about negotiations or lawyers or whomever, you'll find that negotiation is always portrayed, or often portrayed, in a very dramatic way, where people are pounding the table, they're talking about convincing somebody, they want to talk about advocacy or representing their client, perhaps if they're lawyers. And that's forgetting that the other person plays a role in this too. If I'm not negotiating with you if you don't have something I want, I'm not negotiating with you if I'm not trying to keep something you want. So I need to be thinking about something other than just me. And our focus, when we get more scared, more nervous about the uncertainty that is inevitable in every negotiation, is to think more about ourselves and what we want, not how we might be able to make it easier for the other person to also want what we want. Negotiation is a problem to be solved, not a competition to be won. Not everybody will agree with that. That's what I believe about negotiation. Generally speaking, we think about three kinds of negotiators, and this is overly simplistic, but competitive negotiators, cooperative negotiators, and collaborative negotiators. The competitive negotiators are the ones that, they've got to squeeze the last nickel out of every deal. The cooperative negotiators might have kind of a pretty friendly style in the way they talk with you. They show respect. They're polite. They at least seem to listen to you. The collaborative negotiators are looking to try to plant the flag in the same place. I think we're on the same team. We might be talking about different things, but we really want to get to the same place. Here is something to remember. About 80% of people statistically tend to be cooperative negotiators. But if you are a cooperative negotiator dealing with a competitive negotiator, unless you adopt some competitive practices, you will be eaten alive. And it will be uncomfortable for you if you're the cooperative negotiator. In fact, cooperative negotiators often think competitive negotiators are unethical. They're not being nice. They're not being respectful. They're just doing it differently. They've got a different style. It's like a shot fake in basketball is not really what the shooter's going to do, but it's part of the rules. The competitive negotiator will think about rules differently than you do. So keep that in mind. Every negotiation, requires people to be vulnerable at some point, because you've got to, at some point, say what you really want or you really will do or not do. But you need to think carefully about that if you're a cooperative negotiator, because if you disclose that to a competitive negotiator too soon, then again, they're going to eat your lunch. Some of you may know or may have seen around Indiana, Bender Lumber. They're all across Indiana in a lot of small communities. John Bender is one of the founders of that. And he also was one of the founders of Pizza Hut Restaurant. And this is something that I really want to keep in mind personally and as a negotiator. So I was having lunch with John. It's been years ago now. We're sitting in a little diner in Bloomington, Indiana. And another guy comes up, a young man who was just getting involved in the real estate business. And he wanted to talk about this deal that he was going to make. And he told John about the deal. He told him about what the other person knew or didn't know. He talked about the price. And John said, well, what's your goal here? And the young man said, my goal is to squeeze the last nickel out of the deal. And John sat there for a minute. He was quiet. And he said, if your only goal is to squeeze the last nickel out of every deal you have, you will run out of people to do business with. He said, there is a range of deals that can be reached in all kinds of settings. And if your reputation is you don't leave something on the table for the next person in line to also make some profit, and you've got to have every bit of profit, people will stop wanting to do business with you. Now, we all get to decide what that level is, but I find it really important. If all I'm focused on is getting the last nickel, then I'm going to not get some deals where I may run out of people to work with. Again, not everybody will agree with that, but you can think about it. Here's the trust equation. We talked about it a little bit last time. I find this incredibly important for me to keep in mind. My view is that trust is chosen as much as it is earned. The example I usually give is the 16-year-old driving the car. There is no 16-year-old trustworthy driver in my mind, and yet we give them the keys. We've chosen to trust them, perhaps with our knees shaking when we hand our kids the keys. But if you want to build trust, or you want to create trust where it does not already exist, credibility plus reliability plus vulnerability, as those things increased, you will gain more trust. It will make you a better negotiator. So credibility and reliability. Credibility is, do you have the bona fides to do the job? If you're a lawyer, do you have a law degree? If you're a realtor, do you have a realty license? It's those things that really put you in a position to have the conversation at all. Reliability is more relational. Do I return phone calls when you call me back? Do I respond to emails? When I make a commitment to you, do I keep that commitment? If I do those things, trust will go up. Vulnerability is the willingness to disclose things that you could take advantage of me for. I might tell you about something in the past where I made a mistake. I might tell you that there's somebody other than me that could be a better choice for you with this particular problem. So it's not all about me. And that also applies into the self-interest piece of it. If all I'm focused on is myself, people won't trust me as much. They won't disclose as much to me. There may be a deal that could be reached that we don't find because neither one of us is willing to put our toes at least into vulnerability and risk giving up some self-interest to try to reach a deal. So here's our basics review. And as you heard me say last year, you are all professional negotiators. And if you disagree, think about when a baby's born. A baby cries, we respond. We give the baby food. A toddler throws a temper tantrum. We may have different ideas of how we do it, but we respond to that toddler in some way. A teenager is passive aggressive or slams the bedroom door because she's angry. We respond to that in some way. As we get older, we get a little bit more sophisticated perhaps, but what we're looking for is, what can I do to get the other person to do what I want them to do? Back to the initial premise. How can I make it easy for you to do what I want you to do? Why do we negotiate? It's pretty straightforward: to get what we want or keep what we have. Otherwise, there is no negotiation. I want to talk about a specific real life circumstance. I call it Chandra's salary dance. And then we're going to talk about how these things actually apply in this context. So Chandra has a good job with a really large company in Chicago. She was working in one segment of the company. She'd finished her MBA and had an opportunity to go work in another segment of the company. And she was thinking about things like, do I want to take this job? How different is the work? Is this really a promotion? What happens with my salary? And we can have a tendency sometimes when there's a lot going on to want to narrow it and perhaps make it even simpler than it is. And one of the questions is just about salary, and were there more things than salary that were important for Chandra? So here's what I would say is the thoughtful process to negotiation. One is to decide whether you want to negotiate at all. And I'll give you an example here. In the realty market where I am right now, it's going bonkers. And I've heard it's going bonkers in a lot of other areas as well. People will list a house for sale, and within a day, they may have prices over the asking price. So one of the things we decide is, do we want to negotiate? Am I willing to pay? Used to be, I guess it just depends on the market. Somebody offers to sell their house for $250,000, and we might make an opening offer of $220,000. Well, depending on the market, that might do nothing but insult somebody. They go away and we don't get the house. Somebody else buys it. So deciding whether you want to negotiate is important. The next one is preparing to negotiate. And this is the one where many of us become lazy because it's a little uncomfortable. There's always uncertainty with negotiation. So we want to prepare because that actually will give us more confidence when we get to the third section, which is to execute. So here's the way I think about deciding. And Atul Gawande wrote a book called Being Mortal. It was actually about making health and life decisions. But there were 3 questions he asked, and I've changed them a little bit, but I use them almost every day. And the first question is, what do I want? Or what does my client want? And you will find often that people are much quicker to tell you what they don't want than what they do want. It's a big question. The next are, what are my fears and concerns? And the final one is trade-off. So if we go back to the Chandra example, what does she want? Well, she wants to be a team player. She decided that she does want this job. She wished they'd offered her more money. She wants to talk about, coming out of the pandemic, what she might do in terms of working remotely or coming into the office to work, what the job is, where she might do the work, when she might get evaluations. There are a lot of things going on there besides salary. Now, Chandra had decided that she wanted the job. So it was not a case where she was going in and she was going to threaten her new manager and saying, if I don't get this, I'm going to quit. That would certainly be a hardline competitive negotiation, but it also could have left her with no job at all. So those are the things she thought about that she wanted. What are her fears and concerns? Well, she finds negotiation uncomfortable. She finds that it creates conflict and it puts a knot in her stomach. But she also was afraid that if she didn't negotiate, she'd come across as a wimp, somebody who was unwilling to stand up for herself. She was offered an 8% raise. She thought it might be as much as 20%. She thought about if she went in there and argued too hard right at the beginning of a job, her manager might think she's not a team player, and the promotion was working with teams. So she had to put all those things into a bucket and think about them. And then the trade-offs. And this is the place where many of us just stop. We live in a place I call option F, which is fantasy. For me, the easiest example is eating and weight. I always want to lose 10 pounds, and I always want to eat the cake at the end of the day. And they are incompatible. If I go home at the end of the day and I eat a whole chocolate cake, then I'm probably not going to lose the weight. If I go home and don't eat the cake at the end of the day, I'm going to be uncomfortable because it's something I want that I'm technically depriving myself of. So there are always trade-offs in a negotiation. I don't get everything I want. So when Chandra went into this, she thought, what do I want? What are my fears and concerns? What are the trade-offs? She decided one of the trade-offs was she could just take the job as is. She could say, okay, it's 8%. I'm going to take this job. She avoids the discomfort of a negotiation, which she doesn't like. She decided she wanted to have the negotiation, even though she was uncomfortable doing it. So what's the next phase? To prepare. Batten is a term you may have heard. It's the alternative to reaching an agreement, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what's her alternative? One alternative is she could leave, or she could go in and tell the boss, and this happens a lot in university settings where a professor will go out and get a job offer from UCLA and then bring it back to the department chair and say, I've just been offered 20% more at UCLA. Will you pay me 20% more? Now, an important consideration that many of those people don't do is sometimes the department chair says, congratulations, go take that job. So you better think long and hard about how you're going to negotiate that. Some people don't negotiate it very well, and they're moving to Los Angeles when they really hadn't planned on it. So there was a trade-off in there somebody may have missed. But what is the alternative to negotiating at all? In Chandra's case, it might be losing face a little bit. What's the target and the reserve? The target is the goal. What would I like? So if she thought 20%, and she's probably not going to get less than 8%. And the final one is there more than one option? If I listen well, if I go in with something more than just my agenda, then I might learn something from whoever has the power to give me or not give me that raise, or give me something different than the raise that might help create some options that are good for both of us. So in Chandra's case, she went in and she talked about work, the way the work would be done, what the benefits were, where the work might be done, the type of work she might do. She said, I'm really excited about this job. I've decided to take this job. So she's clearly being cooperative. I was a little bit disappointed at the number. I thought it might be as much as 20%. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the science of influence. She said, other people with these kinds of jobs in this company and other places are making about 18 to 20% more than me. Is there something we could negotiate north of 8, but south in 20? So she understands the other person has more power, that has the ability to give her or not give her what she wants. She's decided she's not using the leverage of leaving because she knows her job could be replaced. And so she had that conversation, and the boss ended up giving her a raise, not the 20%, but more than the 8%, which for her she was glad to have. So with the execution piece, what she was doing is these 4 things, and they come up in a great book if you want to read a book on, besides my book, on negotiation, Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey. It was kind of the seminal book on it. And what they talk about is separate the people from the problem. So this wasn't necessarily a problem, but there was more that could be decided, and she didn't want to focus on what she was entitled to, what she deserved, because that tends to turn people off. Talking about entitlement is not a good way to begin. It doesn't make it easy for the person to do it. She talked about interests and positions. She talked about how she wanted to be the job. She wanted the job. She wanted to be a team player. She wanted to know how she could best fit into the team. She talked about those things. She talked about objective standards. There are other people in this industry that are getting paid this. And she gave the boss an opportunity to explain to her why it was 8% and not 20%. And she looked for some mutual gain. What can I do to make this team better? If I'm going to be allowed to work remotely sometimes, are there days that are better for that or days that are worse for that? What works better for you and what works better for the team? So these are kind of the specific tools. Know your alternative, have a target, know your reserve. Are you willing to walk away? Speculate about what you think the other person might be thinking of why. And ZOPA, to throw another acronym in, is the zone of possible agreement. So the zone of possible agreement here was probably not lower than 8%, probably not higher than 20%. There was some uncertainty on both sides about what that might be. So that's what Chandra did. She went in and she had the conversation. She prepared for it. She thought about how she wanted to execute. She thought about what she wanted, and she went ahead and did it. So first of all, make it easy for the other person to do what you want them to do. That begins with you deciding what you want. And here's the action steps. Take the time to consider what you're negotiating and whether it's worth it. People often, they just dive into a negotiation and they don't even realize they're in one sometimes. Be specific about what you want. Know when walking away is worth it, and focus on the interest, the objective standards, not the positions or personalities of the people involved. This is something I didn't spend much time on last time, but I want to talk about it a lot. And this is the single biggest mistake I find people make. What we find routinely for people that research these things is the people that are the best negotiators are the ones that know themselves the best. That doesn't mean you have to have a big personality or a quieter personality, or be more aggressive or less aggressive, or be more competitive or less competitive. But it's the people that know themselves the best. So when they find that they're having that physiological response that discomfort brings to us in the middle of a negotiation, when somebody's not doing it the way we want, or it looks like we might not get what we want, or we're going to have to shift gears and move into territory we hadn't expected, people that know themselves the best tend to do it the best. This I may have talked about my friend Phil last time, and he was going through a tough time. I said, Phil, how you doing? And he said, what I find to be as good an example of any in terms of the human condition. And Phil said, I may not be much, Sam, but I'm all I think about. And what I find is that tends to be a default position for many of us. And particularly when I get more nervous or more afraid about what's going on, I tend to close down, I get tunnel vision, and I forget what's going on around me. That's a good time to pause. So if you find yourself, if every response is the other side's unfair, what you're entitled to, here's what you have to understand, here's what you're missing, talking so much about the other person, you're probably not being very effective, because they are more likely to shut down and come back the same way. It tends to get into a closed loop of nobody listening. This is kind of an example of that. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics in, I think it was 2001. He was at a cocktail party with his wife, and they noticed somebody across the room, and his wife said, that man's really sexy. He undresses the maid himself. And Daniel Kahneman says, what in the heck is she thinking? But they were at a cocktail party. They didn't have time to really talk about it. And they get home, and they're getting ready for bed. And he said, tell me what you were thinking there in terms of he undresses the maid himself. He's really sexy. She said, I didn't say that. I said, he doesn't underestimate himself. Not he undresses the maid himself. Here's the important part of that story, though. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist, it never occurred to him from the time she said it until the time they were getting ready to go to bed and she explained it, that he might have misunderstood rather than her misspeaking or saying something that was silly. Never occurred to him. And for those of us that want to negotiate well, if we don't understand something, and we might be a little bit embarrassed, or it might hurt our pride, or it might make us feel too humble, ask the question. If you don't understand or something doesn't make sense, and you don't have to do it in an accusatory way, but you can say, I'm sorry, I'm missing that. Not that it doesn't make sense. I'm having difficulty understanding this, because it may be you are misunderstanding rather than they are misspeaking. Here's an example of people being so focused on themselves, and it just became a total mess that spiraled downward. In 2000, Matt Harrington was one of the top prospects in baseball, thought to be the top prospect coming out of high school pitchers that year. And he was drafted by the Colorado Rockies. And his agent negotiated. They went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, he turned down a $4 million offer, which means in baseball, you go back into the draft. So he could have had a $4 million offer and a $300,000 bonus. So since he didn't get drafted, or since he didn't take the deal, he could go back and play amateur baseball. He played amateur baseball and he had a bad year. The next year he gets drafted again, this time lower in the draft. He gets drafted by the San Diego Padres. They offer him $1.25 million a year. He decides that's not enough. He was offered $4 million the year before. So he goes back in to play baseball. He had a worse year. He gets drafted by the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. They offer him 100,000. He says no to that. The next year, he was drafted in almost the last round, and the Cincinnati Reds basically gave him a chance to play and nothing else. He was going to, and he made $1,000 a month. There is a tendency to so trust our own thinking or think that we are worth something, and we fail to do some of the preparation that I talked about earlier. What are other people similarly situated getting paid? Why is it I think that I'm so special? And the other thing to remember, and this is a power dynamic part of it, the Colorado Rockies, the San Diego Padres, the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, they might prefer to have somebody who turns out to be a great pitcher, but they'll be fine without him. He lost the opportunity. He was in a much worse position to afford to lose than they were. And that is something to keep in mind when you start thinking you're so special in the middle of a negotiation. Here's the only test you're going to do today, and it's confidential. You don't have to tell anybody, but it factors into this same thing about our overconfidence in ourselves sometimes. So here's what I want you to do. On these 5 things, I want you to think about it. You can write them down or do it as a thought exercise, even though you may not know everybody that's on this conference today. Think about where you would rate yourself in terms of decision-making ability. Do you think you're the best of anybody here? Give yourself 100. You think you're the worst? Give yourself a 1. You think you're somewhere in the middle? Give yourself a 50. What about cooperativeness? Same thing, 100, 50, 1. Honesty, driving ability, level of life experience. You think, boy, I've got a lot of different experiences. I can't imagine anybody that has more different life experiences than me. Give yourself a 100 or a 90 or an 85. Probably doesn't take too much work to do that. My guess is this what happens most of the time, and I won't ask you to raise your hands, that most of you have yourselves at 50% or above on every one of these. And if we've got everybody in this room we're comparing, we can't all be 50% or above. Somebody's going to be a 1, somebody's going to be 100. But the way we think about ourselves, even if we think, well, I'm pretty humble, I don't think I'm 100%, I think I'm a 75%er. But if I think I'm a 75%er on every one of these, and so does everybody else, some of us are going to be wrong about that. So when you think about these things and you think about yourself, pay attention to that and perhaps talk to other people that you might trust to get their impression. Here's one that Time Magazine published, kind of back to self-evaluations again. Who's more likely to go to heaven? Bill Clinton, Michael Jordan, or Mother Teresa? This happened in the 90s. You can do your own ratings. I won't ask you to do this. Here's how the ratings came. Bill Clinton had a 52% chance. Michael Jordan had a 65%. And Mother Teresa had a 79% chance. And who do you think the only people were that had a better chance than them? The people taking the survey. 87% of the people taking the survey did better than anybody else on the chances of going to heaven. So I'm not invoking anybody's religious beliefs, but pay attention when you're rating yourself, how you're doing. Even if you think you're being kind of humble or realistic about it, do you have it right? This is the final part I'm going to talk about this, but I think it's important to show how this really plays out. And this is really more in the range of listening to what other people may tell us. So there was a woman named Francesca Gino who's at Harvard, and she did some research on how people make decisions. And she started with game shows. So these game shows where people are competing and they can ask the audience for help. And what they found is the great majority of game show contestants would have done better if they took the advice of the audience, and yet they don't. If you want to look at a corporate example, when Walmart was going into Germany to open stores, the CEO of Walmart and the board hired people from Germany to talk about what German retail purchases were like, what they expect, what was going to be important to them. But then Walmart decided, we're awful smart. We made a lot of money. We do this really well. They ignored what the German consultant said, and they failed when they went into Germany. Final one is Freddie Mac. For those of you that remember 2008 and the Federal Mortgage Agency, the CEO there had multiple warnings that there was a meltdown that could happen if things didn't go differently. He decided they'd done a lot of research and they decided that meltdown was not going to happen. And here's something else to think about. The longer you've worked on reaching the decision you've reached, the less likely you will be to take thoughts, opinions, or points of view of other people, and you do yourself a disservice. So that doesn't mean you still don't own the decision, and doesn't mean that you have to do what somebody tells you, but to just patently ignore it, you're taking big risks. So here are the takeaways. The more we invest, we think, in what we think, the less we listen to others. So it's uncomfortable, particularly if it's a hard decision, it's uncomfortable to think about things differently than you naturally think about them. But take some time to do this. When we talked last time, I think I spent some time discussing what I call radical listening. And it's not the kind of listening where you're nodding your head and listening to other people and say, gee, I understand. It's radical listening. It's listening to you about something I feel deeply about and being open to the 1% chance that I might be wrong. I'm listening to you with an openness of the possibility that I might change my mind rather than expecting you to change yours. I may not, but I will listen differently. I will hear things differently. I will be able to engage with that person differently. And no matter the decision, the outcome, you always play a part in it. If you go through negotiations thinking you are the victim, you are not going to be a very good negotiator. So one of the fundamental beliefs I find that's really important to people is to realize, even if you don't get what you want, you will be okay. There's a phrase we often hear when folks are going through difficult times, that somebody will say, it's going to be okay. And the turn I like on that phrase is, it may not be okay, but I can be. And that doesn't mean I've gotten what I want, but it's acknowledging that I've got some resilience. I may not get that job. I'll get another job. I might have to go back to school. I might have gotten a pay cut during the pandemic. That sense of resiliency that I do want, because if you think you want it too much, you will pay too much. You will give away too much. You will be done and regret what you did many times. None of these things apply all the time, but keep that in mind. Influence is what I find, and we're at 9:36. I promise I'm going to stop in the next 10 or 15 minutes so people can ask questions if they wish. What I find is really comes from law school experience and teaching law students to negotiate, and from my own experience is, and this kind of goes back to the mistake I just talked about, our self-focus, is we are much more likely to influence somebody than we are to convince them they're wrong. We are much more likely to influence somebody if we're not just advocating for our position and we listen better. And there's a guy named Robert Cialdini who's at the University of Arizona, who really did some experiments to test influence. How are people influenced and when are they influenced? And these are practical things you can think about when you're negotiating before you negotiate, that are things you can really do. So here are the 6: likability, social proof, reciprocity, scarcity, consistency, and authority. And I want to talk about each of them in an example. So likability is similarity. If you find similarities, people will tend to like you better, or you will like them better. Social proof are comparisons of people similarly situated. Reciprocity has an upside and a downside, because when somebody behaves negatively to me, there's an instinct to respond negatively back. It takes a lot of work to not respond negative to negative, or to respond respectfully to somebody who's disrespecting you. Scarcity is the last cookie in the jar. Consistency is about keeping promises, and authority is just the credentials that you have to do the job. So I want to give you the framework of a woman that was making a decision, a difficult decision that she hadn't imagined making, and then how she actually applied it. We literally talked about these things. So this is a woman who had a 6-year-old daughter with her partner at the time, and then they separated, and they had mostly, during the last 6 years, they'd had no court involvement or lawyer involvement at all. They'd agreed on how to raise their daughter. They lived in different places in the same town. They didn't have a formal custody arrangement ordered by the court. They didn't have a formal support order from the court, but they had nevertheless raised their daughter, who was seemingly happy, and they were both going on about their lives. This woman was a therapist, but her dream was ultimately to run an organic farm. And she got an opportunity to run an organic farm in Wisconsin. She lived in Indiana. Her daughter lived in Indiana. Her partner, the father of her daughter, lived in Indiana. And she thought, well, this is going to be great. I'm going to move to Wisconsin, take our daughter. I'll make some arrangements to make sure our daughter still gets to see her dad. And then she told him that, and it all blew up. His response was dramatically different. She couldn't imagine how he would not want her to pursue her dream, and how he would not think that it was great for their daughter to be living on this farm in Wisconsin. And so they're both kind of stuck. So here's kind of what we went through. And she called me, she gave me permission to talk about this. I'm not disclosing confidential client information. And I was not her lawyer. We were just simply talking about the conflict and ways she might deal with it, and ways she might negotiate with her daughter's father. So one of the things about likability, people with similar names are twice as likely to return surveys. That's just the example they did in the experiment. But here's what this woman did in talking to her daughter's father. She said, first of all, after having a first angry response when he told her, she took some time, and then she went back to talk. She said, I just didn't expect a response. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just didn't expect it. We've got some things we need to talk about. It sounds like we're both frustrated, both a little scared. I know that I'm not entitled to take our daughter away to Wisconsin. I'd like to figure out a way for us to have some kind of a conversation about that. So that's the way she went back. So there is some similarity here. She was not disputing that her daughter's father didn't love their daughter. But she did start to understand that they saw what that looked like differently. And that created a little bit more of a likable position. Social proof. She talked to him about things, other arrangements other people had made. And she gave the full gamut that some people in these circumstances, when a parent moved away, the child stayed. In others, the child moved away. People found things everywhere in between. And based on what they wanted to do, could they have some conversations about that? She was aware of some circumstances where a daughter or a father or a mother had moved away with a child, and it still worked for that to happen and everybody maintained their relationship. She wasn't insisting that that's what happened, but she said these are some things to think about. She did not require him to give her an answer and agree to anything. Reciprocity. Even though he was really angry with her, and even the second time she went back and she was angry with him, he was still angry with her. She did not reciprocate his anger. She said, I don't blame you for being angry. I want us to figure this out, because our alternative, back to BATNA, if we can't agree to this, we're both going to lawyer up. We're going to turn this over to a judge, and a judge that will not have time to consider what either of us really think is important is going to be making a decision about our daughter. So let's think about that. Scarcity, and that piece leads right into scarcity. They had a unique opportunity between the two of them to reach an agreement, one that didn't have to involve the courts, one that didn't involve judges, but she acknowledged it was probably going to be hard for both of them because they both had some very strong feelings about what ought to happen, and they felt very strongly about the daughter. Consistency. This is kind of making it what they found, and the example they used, or that Caldini used, is a restaurant changed what they were saying to people when they called to make reservations. And for no-shows. And so what they would say, instead of saying, please call us or let us know if you're not going to come, they specifically asked the question this way: if you are not going to keep this reservation, would you please call and let us know before the time of the reservation? And they waited for the person to say yes. Most of us like our word to be good. And if someone has asked us for a commitment and we've made it, we are more likely to keep it. And we're particularly more likely to keep it if we've made it publicly. So there are ways to ask questions that aren't angry, aren't demanding. It was a request. It wasn't a requirement. It said, would you please, if you're not, and their no-shows dropped from 30% to 10%. Huge change in their profitability. And the final one is authority. And in this case, there really wasn't a competition here. What the mother did is talk to the father and said, we've been co-parenting our daughter for years. And we both have authority to have our opinions. We may not disagree, but I've got to believe we can reach some kind of an agreement here. So what happened, I'll get to the takeaways and actions. They did reach an agreement. I mean, her first thought was, I'm going to move to Wisconsin. I'm going to take our daughter with us. I'll make some extra effort to make sure our daughter can get back to Indiana to see her dad. As they talked about things, and she acknowledged that her daughter had a friend group here, had teachers here that she liked at school, certainly had a relationship with her father. And they talked about, and the way they compromised it was, for the first year, something the mother had never considered before, their daughter would stay here in Indiana. And she'd have some extended visitation. She'd come back here. The daughter would come up there. And what the daughter's father pointed out is, you've got a lot going on to start a farm. You may not even have the time you would like to have with our daughter as much as you care about her. So how about if we start the first year where she stays here, the summer she spends with you, we'll switch it the next year, and then we'll see how it plays out. They didn't feel like they had to make a permanent decision on what was going to happen forever, but that's what they were going to do. And it took just as much effort and skill and thoughtfulness on his part as it did from hers, because he was just as angry and just as afraid about losing a relationship with his daughter as she was. And they found a way to talk their way through it, and they didn't have to involve courts other than to go to court and say, we've reached this agreement, and let the court know. So they had legal authority to do that. So find things in common with people. Focus on the uniqueness of the opportunity to reach a deal. It's what we are doing in mediations every day. Keep your promises and find objective measures of value, which kind of combines the last two things that we've talked about. I just want to give you some final thoughts, and then I'm happy to take questions. And I know Cindy's going to give some books away. So these are things to keep in mind that normally don't stay in our minds as we are negotiating or in conflict or afraid we're going to lose something we have or not get something we want. First is proportionality. How you feel matters to guide behavior, but not dictate it. Going back to immortals, if in times of high emotion, what I'm going to say makes me feel better, it's probably not the best thing to say. That applies to our actions as well. If I'm really fired up, if the next thing I'm going to do makes me feel better, it's probably not the best thing to do. So I want to be able to think about it, pause, and do it differently. The focusing illusion. This goes back to Kahneman again, and what he finds, and we can talk about the experiments another time, is nothing is so important as when you're focusing on it. So that's why you see art auctions in New York. You think, how did anybody pay $65 million for a painting? But it doesn't have to be a painting in New York. You might think about the auction you went to buy a lamp at the county fairgrounds. All of a sudden, this lamp that you could probably buy on Craigslist for $5, somebody offers 10 for it, and you offer 15, and then all of a sudden somebody pays $75 for a $5 lamp. So as I'm focusing about it, it becomes very, very important to me. And your part. There is no conflict. There is no negotiation without you. An appropriate choice in some circumstances, whether it was Chandra on her salary negotiation or any of us in what we're doing, an appropriate choice, maybe I'm not going to negotiate. I'm going to pay the price for the house. I'm going to take the job and not negotiate the salary. There are all kinds of reasons where we might choose that, and it is a perfectly fine choice. It doesn't mean we're weak. It doesn't mean we weren't willing. It means we decided that was the best decision for us. When we think about what we want, what our fears and concerns are, what the trade-offs might be, we've made the decision that we don't want to negotiate sometimes, or that we do, and then the way we want to do it. Uncertainty is inherent in negotiation and conflict. If there wasn't some uncertainty about an outcome, then there is nothing to negotiate. Even if it's the internal negotiation of getting out of bed, you're thinking about, what are the consequences? Am I hurting my team? What's my boss going to think about me? But golly, I'm really tired because I actually stayed up working till 2 a.m. last night. Doubt is unpleasant, but certainty is absurd. That's why most people, when you see that some of the new car places that say no hassle car buying, it's because so many people don't want to negotiate. That has great appeal. Most people don't have to have the best deal. They just don't want to be played for the fool. So if they get a deal within that reasonable range in their minds, based on their relationship with the person and what they think is an appropriate price or appropriate job circumstance, they're okay. And the other thing to keep in mind is the moment of absolute certainty never comes, which Dark Rain Tom said, and that's option F. We want to live as if there's certainty. 100%. I've done over 4,000 mediations, and 100%, not 99.9, 100% of those cases happened because something occurred in those people's lives that they didn't expect to happen. It could be a catastrophic accident. It could be a construction collapse. It could be a breached agreement. It could be somebody going bankrupt. It could be a spouse finding another partner. People don't get married expecting to get divorced. People don't start a business expecting their partner to embezzle money. So uncertainty is everywhere, but we live as if it doesn't exist, or even as if we're entitled for it not to exist. So negotiation is physical. So the first thing I would say is recognize that it's physical. Recognize that you've got a little discomfort in your stomach, or your heart rate is going up a little bit, or your hands are a little bit sweaty. And when you recognize that, pause. Unless that kind of fear response that is similar to being startled, unless it's really life-threatening, then take a minute. Think, is this a time I want to respond and say exactly what's on my mind because it'll push the other person away and make me feel safer? Is this a time for me to really do something and get up and walk away from the table? Or is this a time for me to just sit there and sit in the discomfort of the uncertainty, which is a hard thing to do? And then you make a choice. And with that choice, that's your best choice with the information you have available. You've made your best effort. And many times, as much as we want to think we can control outcomes, we can't. We accept that we can play a role to influence other people. We may get what we want, we may not, but we want to remember we can be okay, even if we don't. Thank you so much for having me back. I can't tell you what a privilege it's been to come back a second year. We didn't talk about power and fear and trust and justice and righteousness and bias, which are all part of negotiation in a full bang all day class, or if I'm coming in to help a team on something, we talk about those things. If I could help your organization or your board of directors or anybody with just really a conflict situation or a negotiation situation, formally or informally, I'd be happy to do it. I'm literally doing it every day. You can reach me at these places, as we said before. If you send me a LinkedIn invite, I will accept it. Instagram, you can follow me, and you can look at my blog. I post a blog. There are probably 40 blogs up on my website now. You're welcome to look at any of them. I post one sometimes weekly, sometimes every couple of weeks, rarely less often than that. And if you've got a specific question, you can reach me at sartery@lawbr.com. And if you do want a copy of the slides, I would ask that you not use them other than for your own internal purposes, that you don't duplicate them and use them somewhere else. And as I said, the charge will be a 4-question survey. So these are the places you can get a hold of me. It would be my pleasure to hear from any of you. And that is it. I am done. So Cindy, if you'd like to give away some books or do something more, or Melissa, I'm happy to get out of the way and turn over the chair. And thank you again, everybody, for showing me the courtesy of coming today on a Wednesday morning to talk about these things that are incredibly important to me. And I find they affect all parts of my life. Thank you very much.
Sam, that was outstanding content. Boy, it was rich. I'm so grateful for you, for your willingness to come back and speak with our group. And judging by the attendance, we had a lot of interest in the program. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa and Bob to do the book giveaway at this point. But thanks so much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Melissa with the Columbus Chamber. Thank you for being here this morning. Sam, so much great information. It was very rich, like Cindy said. I will be going back to the recording and taking more notes. We have 5 copies of, let's see, the book to give away this morning, Positively Conflicted. A few people I drew ahead of time. I'm not sure if they're on the call. So I'm going to start with the original winners, and then I have a couple extra just in case they're not on here. But first, is Mary Hamlin on the call this morning? Mary? Casey Passwater. Congratulations, Casey. Katina Tooley. Kathy Holweger. And is Deepti on the call this morning? Okay, then I have Heather Cecil and Leah Elliott. So congratulations to each of you. And I will get with you after this call and we'll find the best way to get the book to you. And at this time, if there's any questions, Sam, do you have time for a few questions in case there's questions?
I do. I'd be delighted to have questions, and they don't have to cover the content. So I'll tell you I don't know, or I'll tell you what I think.
Sounds good. So if you have any questions, you can unmute, go ahead and ask questions. And if not, you know how to reach Sam. He has a lot of great ways to get a hold of him. I'm looking in the chat and all right. And it doesn't look like we have any questions right at the moment. So
may I answer one question that wasn't asked that I sometimes get asked, and we didn't talk about it much today, and we'll still be done in the next 2 minutes. Is I was giving a talk about conflict and mediation to an international organization of lawyers, and when we finished, the first question that was asked is, why do you think humility is important? And I was taken aback a little bit because and maybe it was because of a group of lawyers, but I don't want to stereotype lawyers. You can read about bias and stereotype in the book. But here's the answer I gave. One is I found if any of us go into the room and think we're always the smartest person in the room, then we're missing something, both in terms of relationships and opportunities. But here's the other and most important part of that, and that's why I talk about radical listening, is if I can't be humble, if I don't have a degree of humility, accepting that I don't know all of the answers, then it is impossible for me to effectively listen. It is impossible for me to show respect for the other person. And that's not necessarily the place most people think of when they think about conflict and negotiation, where they've learned to politely pause and act like they're listening. And then after the pause, they go right back to their agenda after that. But I would encourage everybody, and I'm not going to ask anybody to tell their stories, but I found that humility time and time again is so important, but it's not humility that makes you a doormat. It takes a certain amount of self-confidence, back to the I can be okay piece of it, to be able to be humble, to be able to be resilient and know that if you don't get what you want, you can still be okay. And it actually increases the chances of you getting what you want more often than not. So I guess that is the last piece I would leave people with, even though nobody here asked it, is pay attention to the humble part of it. When you find yourself really getting stirred up and thumping your chest and wanting to lean into somebody, think, wow, what am I afraid of here? What's going on here? Why can't I be a little bit more humble? Do I really think I can't be okay if this doesn't go my way? I find it happens in marriages. It happens in workplaces. It happens with children. It happens in airports. So that's just one final thought I would give you. Think about what role humility does or doesn't play in your life, when it's appropriate to be more or less humble, because I find it's huge in terms of conflict and negotiation both. Thanks again.
We're getting a couple comments in the chat. Give me 1 second and I'll see if there's any questions here at the last minute. Let's see here. Eric Baird has a question. He wants to know if you can repeat the lemon story from the last time you spoke to the group.
I can. I tried not to repeat too much, but I'm delighted to repeat the lemon story. It's one of my favorites. A little boy and a little girl both want a lemon, and there's only one lemon in the house. And so they're kind of yelling at each other and both trying to take the lemon away from the other. They got it out of the refrigerator and they go to their mother and they say, I want the lemon. I ought to have the lemon. And so what does the mother do? She suggests that they split the lemon in half. And so that's what she does. And after she split the lemon, she learns that the little boy wanted only the lemon rind to use for a lemon meringue pie. And the little girl wanted the inside of the lemon to make lemonade. So actually splitting the lemon, which was her first thing, we're going to compromise and split this. She didn't ask enough questions to learn that the whole lemon could be used in a way where nobody gives anything up. And back to the blinder piece of it, it is so easy to put on blinders and take our past experience and say, I know the answer to this, or to give somebody an answer before you've heard the entire story because you're impatient, or you just think you know, or you're tired of hearing one more story. So that's the lemon story from last year. Sometimes the best choice is not to split the lemon. And I find that in mediations all the time.
Wow, that's a great story. Great reminder for sure. All right, well, if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. But we just want to thank Sam very much for your time and your expertise. And there's just so much to take away, like you said, personally and professionally. And we thank you, everybody, for your time this morning. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, everybody. Reach out to me if I can answer any other questions privately. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, guys.